Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, July 10th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about abortion referendums across the United States now popping up in red, blue, and swing states, and why this is ultimately a big mistake for the Republican Party. Now, following the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, the decision that effectively overturned Roe versus Wade, the 49-year-long precedent that abortion was a constitutional right, a woman's right to choose, was protected by the right to privacy in her own health. That decision was overruled by a conservative court that has now led to these new constitutional amendments being propped up as ballot referendums for the 2022 midterm elections. Now, if you don't know exactly what is happening, sometimes there are ballot initiatives that are put forth in a general election. And the reason why they are put there is to ensure that voters have a say in the democratic process, have a say as to what laws are being passed within their states. But sometimes they are put forth largely to avoid a veto from a governor. Sometimes they are put forth to avoid a lack of a supermajority, meaning a lack of compromise and a lack of movement between different political parties, but rather just putting it directly to the voters. This really comes across as something that seems to be genuine in the aspect that you are gauging voters and their beliefs on this topic, but knowing exactly where they are and the strategic movement, not necessarily in Pennsylvania, but in Kansas and other states on the day of the referendum, really does question the genuinity of it all altogether. What we have seen thus far is that these new referendums sometimes contain pieces of information that are extremely important to note. As we've seen with the Pennsylvania Senate, this isn't just a constitutional amendment on abortion, but what they had tried to do and what will potentially become law should this initiative pass is that the lieutenant governor now becomes an appointed position. In addition to that, there are other parts of this entire process that would make it difficult for people to vote. If this passes, it isn't just dealing with a constitutional right to an abortion in the state of Pennsylvania, but so much more than that. And this video isn't about the contents of that bill. I will actually be talking about different bills where there are sneaky parts of it being thrown into it rather than just the standard question, should abortion be restricted or not within a state? There is a lot to unpack there. But as I said in the beginning of this video, we are talking about the electoral implications of having an abortion referendum on the ballot. Because right now, I think the Republican Party is going too far in terms of what they want to do with these provisions. Now, in some states, they are limited. There is a reason why they would go to the voters rather than just deciding to do it themselves, because many states have already chosen to ban abortion. If you take a look at a bunch of these states, you find that abortion is already prohibited in Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Wisconsin. That is where a ban is in full effect. Also, South Dakota. You also have states where a ban is expected soon: Idaho, Wyoming, North Dakota, Tennessee, 4 individual states. And then you have bans that were put into effect, then blocked by judges that will likely end up going up further down the court line and eventually overruled in that ban because the Supreme Court, the highest court in the law in the land, already decreed that this would be fine. So the ban was blocked in Kentucky, Utah, and Arizona, but ultimately that doesn't matter, because it will eventually become effect in these states. And there's not much the Democratic Party can do. But in some of these states, there already is abortion access and abortion protected into the Constitution, or at least interpreted as such. So these states are putting forth these referendums, not necessarily to bolster GOP turnout, but to overturn abortion access within their states. But I think this is a bad move electorally and a bad move for anyone who supports a women's right to choose. So with Pennsylvania moving forward this constitutional amendment, in addition to Kansas, on top of ones that have already secured ballot access in Colorado and Montana, which there is another state here, also Kentucky, so we will see what happens there. But I can't imagine that these are the last ones. The GOP is truly biting more off than they can chew. Because putting it forth towards the ballot in 2022, I don't think makes a lot of sense. In fact, putting it to the ballot at all doesn't really make a lot of sense in terms of an electability standpoint. If we're looking at some of these states, for instance, Colorado, where Republican proponents and pro-life proponents have put forth initiatives to ban abortion to the ballot, they are doing this because they think that this election year might be red enough that abortion is banned in some of these states. But they are definitely making a mistake. 2022 is definitely going to be a red wave year. I use definitely too much. It is going to be a red wave year. The question is, how much is this red wave defined? Democrats aren't going to have a 2018 type year, but Republicans probably aren't going to have a 2010 or 2014 type year. Anytime they win the popular vote, we could probably call it a red wave, but also that does get a bit tricky. I just think that that's the best way to describe it at this point in time. But when you have blue states and even some red states that don't exactly feel the same way the National Republican Party does on the issue of abortion, giving voters an avenue to vote on this position means that you will have politicians taking sides in addition to their own campaigns. What I mean is that a Republican nominee for governor or Senate in the state of Colorado will be asked a question at a debate, or will be asked a question by a reporter. Because this referendum is going to be very important, this ballot initiative is going to be very important, of course they're going to have to take a position. Now, they might come from a state that doesn't exactly support the pro-life agenda, doesn't support the Republican Party or the Supreme Court in their endeavors. But because they are a Republican, they have to take the pro-life stance. When you have voters being associating certain candidates with different positions on an abortion ballot referendum, that's where it gets tricky for the GOP. Because as unfortunate as it is for the Republican Party's electability, but fortunate for those who support a woman's right to choose, the overwhelming majority of the nation does not support restrictions or bans on abortion. In fact, 61% of the nation believes that it should be legal in all/most cases. Joe Biden only won 51% of the vote in the last election, and that was by 5 points nationwide. That was a pretty strong showing, meaning that baseline, this is doing much better for those who believe that abortion should be legal. And when taking a look at the issue state by state, I have highlighted all of the states that approve of abortion access, but also voted for President Trump in 2020 and also 2016. There are some states on here that even voted for Trump in 2016 that I didn't highlight because they voted for Biden. Look at Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan. These are states that voted for Trump 6 years ago, that voted for Biden 2 years ago, that support a women's right to choose. Look at some of these states: Missouri, Kansas, North Carolina, Oklahoma, surprisingly enough. I don't know if I buy the Oklahoma number entirely, but this isn't the only poll or the only collection of data that says that it is supported there. Iowa, Ohio, Montana, Florida, Alaska. Alaska pretty consistently in every single poll supports a women's right to choose. It seems that a right to privacy there is very popular. Same thing with Montana. I would implore you to take a look at some of those numbers there. Very surprising, to say the least. But the point is that in many of these states, abortion isn't exactly this topic or this position, being pro-choice being that position, that is unpopular across some of these states. And that's where it gets tricky. Because should you put a ballot referendum, for instance, in Kansas, a state where people support a right to privacy, people support a women's right to choose, they might not necessarily be as inclined as they were previously to vote for the Republican nominee for governor in the 2022 ballot. Because people are going to also be excited and also energized to vote in this referendum, it might become the top tier issue for the voters in this state. If all they're hearing about from TV ads, from radio ads, from yard signs is on this ballot referendum, even if inflation is an important issue, healthcare is an important issue, immigration is an important issue, if all they are being told and campaigned about is the general election campaign and abortion, it will skyrocket in terms of importance for voters, because that's just how human psychology works. They see it, they surround themselves by it, maybe directly or indirectly, just by living in an area where it's heavily campaigned, or their neighbors are putting up countless yard signs, whatever it might be, they're going to be constantly reminded of this question. And when voters here might be willing to vote for President Trump, that was before we even saw Roe v. Wade come into the realm of possibility at being overturned. We've had countless Republican presidents in the past 49 years, and Roe v. Wade is overturned under a Democrat. Not because of a Democrat, but under a Democratic president. So now that this is the first time in 5 decades where voters will be able to cast their ballot on the issue of abortion and have it binding, it will inspire those and also change some voters' views if this is given to them through an option. If you take a look at the national numbers following the Dobbs decision, the shift on average is Democrat +3. Let's say a Republican was to win a race by 1 or 2 points, cough, cough, Dr. Oz in the state of Pennsylvania, by 1 or 2 points. This shift, should it last into November, is enough to push the Democratic Party back on top in a year that simply should be so easy for the Republican Party. It also isn't just the few individual states that have abortion restrictions or have these abortion ballots on here already. there are going to be plenty more. Pennsylvania, I think this is a very bad move for the Republican Party. You take a look at their choice and what their decision is across the state, it's plus 13. Biden only won the state by 2. So when voters go to the ballot and shoot down a referendum such as this one by 13, as is expected and has been done in many states, they aren't going to be inclined to go to Dr. Oz or Doug Mastriano, especially when they are going to be actively campaigning for this to pass, actively campaigning on the ideology that promoted this referendum. It just doesn't help. That slight association with a pro-life agenda or an anti-abortion rights agenda won't help people in states that support abortion access. I don't know why that's so hard to see. I don't know why that's so hard to understand, but it's real. This is the first time, again, voters will have in 50 years to vote on the issue of abortion and have it mean something. And I can tell you right now, voters might not necessarily vote for the Democratic Party in droves. I still think it will be a red wave. But in those races where it matters, those 1 to 2 point races, yes, that 3-point shift absolutely matters. And it matters especially in states where abortion bans and referendums have failed and been put on the ballot before. This is not the first time that we have seen an abortion measure put on the ballot. There have been plenty upon plenty across these states. One notable one that I would like to point out is South Dakota and North Dakota. In 2014, there was a question here: do you want to consider conception or a right to life established at the beginning of a child being in a womb, at someone knowing that they're pregnant? That failed 64 to 36. This would have been able to allow North Dakota to restrict the right to an abortion. Now, eventually, this would have been defeated by a Supreme Court or by a court, or simply would not have been able to be enforced because it would be ruled unconstitutional. But that simply isn't the case anymore. But North Dakota, to remind you, is an overwhelmingly Republican state. Trump won here by 33. Romney won here 2 years prior to that referendum, failing by 30 points, by 20. This is a red state, and it isn't the only one that has been put forth with this question about banning abortion and shooting it down. If you take a look, South Dakota actually has one coming up in 2024, but in 2006 they had a question. Do you support defeating or removing the right to an abortion? Do you believe in banning abortion across South Dakota? Again, this is a Republican state. 2004, George Bush won it by 22 points. 2 years later, they shoot down this referendum by 11 points statewide. These are safe red states. And even in states that are amongst the reddest, sometimes they do pass. This isn't to say that you never see a state on the side of being pro-life, because there absolutely are ones. Every state above Missouri here is inherently pro-life, but not necessarily by the margins that you might expect. And that's why it gets difficult. So when you take a look at some of these referendums, for instance, Tennessee, this was held in 2014. They said, do you want to vote establishing through an amendment that there is no state constitutional right to an abortion and give the legislature the power to regulate abortion? This passed barely. And when I say barely, I mean barely. This is a state that 2 years prior to this referendum voted for Romney by 20. 4 years later, voted for Trump by 26, and in 2020 voted for Trump by 23. Tennessee is one of the redder states in the country, yet they only passed this referendum by 5 points. West Virginia, another state, 2016 election, voted for Trump by 42. What happens 2 years later? West Virginia, through this no right to abortion constitutional measure, only passed by 3 points statewide. This tells you there are voters out there that establish and say, okay, I am a Republican. I voted for Trump. I voted for Romney. I voted for McCain. I voted for Bush twice. I voted for Dole. I voted for H.W. Bush. I voted for Reagan. But I still support a woman's right to choose. Those voters do exist. And if one thing was to change their mind, I don't think you're talking about a shift such as West Virginia. That's what, a 42 to 3. That's a 39-point drop-off between a pro-life candidate winning the presidential election through that state and then also a pro-life initiative winning by only 3. You're not going to see a 39-point drop-off. That's entirely unrealistic to expect. But you can expect some drop-off. And you've already seen it happen nationally. Again, we should not expect or foresee a blue wave year in 2022, but there is some effect. Republicans have been very quick to say that there is no effect by Roe v. Wade. There is no effect by this Dobbs decision. Voters care about gas prices, which have been going down. Voters care about inflation, which seems to be getting better. We might be on the verge of being in a recession, but there are also things going on at the same time that voters seem to also care about in addition. As much as the Republican Party would like to make this entire election about the economy, that clearly isn't working. Because if it was, they wouldn't be leading by just 2 points nationwide. They should be up by double digits at this point. In addition to that impact and that shift on the national level, I can only imagine the detrimental impact of the GOP in states where this becomes a statewide issue. It won't matter to voters in Maryland and Delaware and Connecticut and New York when there isn't a question on the ballot and when there's no threat to it. There's a reason why some of these safer blue states have seen very little shifts in their already Democratic states and Democratic ideologies as to how they're voting. Because some of these people that cared were already voting blue. But in some of these swing states, it gets very tricky for the GOP. The Democrats are going to campaign on this. Josh Shapiro and John Fetterman are going to campaign on this. And so are the Republican Party. Except Republicans are going to consistently take the unpopular opinion in every state leftward of Missouri on this list. It's going to matter to voters in Georgia, but except voters in Georgia support a women's right to choose. Same thing in Ohio, Iowa, New Mexico, Virginia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, Florida, Colorado, all swing states that have high levels of approval for abortion or higher than you might expect looking at its past election results or based off of its electoral composition. Because that's just how it is. Voters out there support a women's right to choose 61 to 37. And it's been that way for practically decades. So when this question comes before voters, they are going to know which side stands on which. And while I don't think this will lead to a blue wave, I do think this will help the Democratic Party in states where they previously had no chance at victory or a significantly slimmer chance at victory. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.